Well, my name is Sean Rossi, and I've met most of you, but some of you, as I've said, as I prayed, have come a long way, and I'll be meeting you for the first time. Very, very warm welcome. Together with Miko there, we lead ATI, Agricola Theological Institute, and once again, welcome to this conference. Now, the subject of the conference is John Calvin, his life and theology, and our speaker is Dr. Tony Lane, and I'll introduce you to Tony in just a moment, and please do call him Tony. That is his request, and thank you for that, Tony. But first I want to share with you a bit of the dialogue that Tony and I shared through email when thinking about the subjects that he would talk about during the conference. And I wrote to Tony, in terms of the topics, your talks, we think, they should be introductory, as Calvin is not a well-studied figure here in Finland, generally speaking. Particularly among evangelicals in Finland, few know anything about him. What people tend to know is limited to certain portions of his theology with which they tend to disagree, predestination, the 5 points, etc. So his other contributions are ignored. And I think we can all agree, at least to some extent, that that is true. Calvin does tend to get a lot of bad press here in Finland, and very few perhaps take the time to actually meet the man, and meet the man behind the myths, and to understand his teaching on his own terms. And that is what we look forward to doing in this conference over this weekend. And so without further ado, let me introduce our speaker to you. Tony Lane is professor of historical theology at London School of Theology, where he's been since 1973, I believe. He studied math and theology at Oxford and Cambridge, and was awarded a Doctor of Divinity degree by Oxford in 2004. He enjoys Christian doctrine, especially its history, and his desire as a teacher is that his students will become more aware of the riches of the Christian heritage, and therefore he enjoys trying to make Christian doctrine simple and understandable and applicable to his students. And to this end, he has written a number of books, and several of them on John Calvin. One of them will be available to you to purchase at the conference in the lobby during the breaks. Tony is married to Maggie, and they have 2 married daughters and, is it correct, 6 grandchildren. And it is in fact through one of Tony's daughters that Tony and I, and Tony and our church, a church where I serve as pastor, have a connection with Tony. Tony's son-in-law is a man called Ibrat. And Ibrat was a university student in Helsinki many years ago, over 10 years ago, 12 years ago now. And Ibrat was first a summer student at the University of Helsinki, where he found a Bible study that was being held in my home. I still do not know how he found out about that Bible study, but he did show up at my door, and he came to the Bible study that my wife and I were hosting in our home. And after that, Ibrat and I became very good friends, and we spent a lot of time during the summer together. The next year, Ibrat became a master's degree student at the University of Helsinki, and at that time he attended our church, and we became very close friends. And it was during the course of our friendship and our long walks — he lived across the street, in fact, for a time, I believe Ibrat lived with my wife and I. Our long walks, I remember them fondly. He used to tell me about a girl, and that girl was a girl called Helen, who was Dr. Lane's daughter. And to make a long story short, Helen visited Finland once or twice and visited our church, and I was privileged to be one of the best men for Ibrat at their wedding together in England about 10 years ago now. And so it was during that time, Dr. Tony hosted us in his home. I got to know him and his wife and his family, and we enjoyed some very nice time together. I remember sitting in your garden, enjoying a nice drink and discussing various things. And so thank you for your hospitality. We hope we'll return the favor over the weekend. And now, obviously, I took the opportunity, knowing your son-in-law, to text him and ask him if he might provide for us here at the conference a few tidbits of your biography that were not readily available on the internet, and the many sources where your biography is available. And so I wrote to Ibrat, and I said, would you please provide, something special for me to read out about Tony during my introduction of him. In fact, I tried 3 times, and he refused to give me anything. He said, I do not dare, Sean. Finally, he said, Sean, well, one thing I know is that his grandchildren like to call him the big bad wolf. But he refused to tell me why that was so, but that we should ask you. And so perhaps, maybe not now, but in the course of the weekend, as I invite you up now, Tony, to speak to us, you'll tell us not only about John Calvin, but about the big bad wolf. Welcome.
When you said about he writing something about me, I was thinking I was going to have to say I was going to go home and rewrite my will, but yes, okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, a great pleasure to be here. I mean, I love talking about Calvin, so that's a great pleasure for me. And well, I've just come from St. Petersburg, where I've been since last Sunday, and with all the packing and thinking about that, I forgot the fact that I've actually got 2 Calvin T-shirts, so you're going to be spared seeing those. But I did not forget that I have my Luther, Here I Stand socks. I have a pair of them in English, which Ibrat and Helen brought back for me from Wittenberg, and then I was in Wittenberg myself in 2016 and got it with the German. And so I was delighted when we sang Ein fester Burg, strong, safe stronghold, our God is still, however the English comes out, reminding us of Luther, because of course Finland is very much a Lutheran country. So I'm sure the name Luther will be mentioned a few times but obviously our focus now is on Calvin. So thank you very much again for the invitation and for the introduction. I feel I got off reasonably lightly. Okay, so we have the first one, John Calvin, This Is Your Life. And there used to be a series of programs in England on television ages ago called Joe Blogg's This Is Your Life, and somebody would come along and discover to their amazement that people from the past came and so on. Well, I haven't brought anybody of Calvin's contemporaries along, but I have got some pictures to show you. Well, John Calvin was born on the 10th of July, 1509, at Noyon in Picardy, northern France, into a middle-class family. There's the house where he was born, and taken from various angles. I was there in 2009, which of course was the anniversary of his birth. We jumped ahead a bit there. And there's a view from the air. Yes, so this is he was born in that house, but in fact it has been rebuilt. And if you know some French, you'll see that's what it says there. So it isn't the original house, because that was 500 years ago, and so it's been replaced on the same spot. And it's a museum now, as you can see from this interior room. Now, I visited it in 1982 for the first time, and I was told then that no Protestants lived in Noyon at that time. I don't know if that's still true, but I do know that it was lavishly refurbished for the anniversary of his birth, and a big museum built nearby. As you can see, quite a big museum, and note the cathedral, reflection of the cathedral in the glass. And there were big celebrations for the anniversary. And the road is called the Rue Calvin, so they've named that particular road, the road by his house, after him. And also a local secondary school is called the Lycée Jean Calvin. So he is acknowledged by his hometown at last. Well, Calvin was baptized in his parish church, Santa Godebert, which used to look like this, but it was destroyed in the French Revolution. And he lived near the cathedral. Well, you could see that already from the picture I showed you with the cathedral reflected in the museum. And here you see, if you look on the left is his house, and just on the right is the cathedral, just a short distance away. And just a few pictures there. Cathedral looking down the road and looking up at the towers and seen from the other side. Well, it was badly damaged in the First World War, but has survived. And here we see inside it, and there's a nice Renaissance chapel built in 1528 by the bishop, Charles de Hungest, and he came from an influential family with which Calvin had strong connections. So he has a sort of indirect connection with that chapel. There's also an old library near the cathedral, and we've got various shots of that. This was actually in November. I mean, I was incredibly lucky. I was just there for a few hours in November, and the sun shone for me. You know, it could have been well, in November it could be dire weather, could have been pouring with rain. And here also is the bishop's palace, which has survived. Now, near Noyon is the Abbey of Oostkamp, I'm sure my pronunciation isn't right, which was noted for its collection of relics. And Calvin would certainly have visited it as a child. In later life, he wrote a treatise on relics, to which we'll return in a few minutes. And it was probably based in part on his earlier experiences at that abbey. But going back as a young teenager, Calvin went to Paris to study and to earn his BA and MA. In those days, people went to university much younger than they would today. So he was just a sort of, as I say, a young teenager. And he studied for a while at the Collège de la Marche under a man called Mathurin Cordier, with whom he maintained an ongoing relationship. But from there, he moved to the Collège de Montaigu, on the site of which lies today's Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, which I'll show you in a moment. And on this map here, up the top, on, well, sort of at 9 o'clock, no, 3 o'clock, it says Collège de Montaigu. And there's Notre Dame, the cathedral, down in the bottom corner. And this is what it looks like today, or at least what it looked like in 1982. And it's now a library on the site of the old college. Now, this was not a happy experience for Calvin. And in fact, the conditions were so bad, they may have caused some of Calvin's lifelong health problems. Montaigu was a bastion of orthodoxy and opposed to the Reformation. Now, various other people had studied there. Erasmus, the great humanist, had studied there and also spoke very negatively about it. And intriguingly, Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, studied there as well, around the same time as Calvin. Now, we can't be sure exactly which years Calvin was there, and they could have overlapped, they could have even met, which is a fascinating possibility. Now, this is called the Tower of Calvin, Calvin's Tower, and there's a tradition that Calvin had a room at the top. That's not actually awfully likely, because the tower wasn't built till sometime after Calvin left Paris. But anyway, it's a nice thought. I think buildings can people can posthumously acquire a connection with buildings, so that's why I showed it. Now, Calvin's studies were intended as a preparation for the study of theology, which is what his father wanted. But his father fell out with the clergy at Noyon, so when the time came, when Calvin had done his MA, and it was time to move on to theology or whatever, his father wanted him to do law instead. And so, ironical, because Luther also, his father wanted him to do law, so there's a link there. And Calvin, first of all, went to Orléans, and this building is the Salle des Thèses, which I think is the only survival of the old university from the time of Calvin. And there's a picture of what it looks like inside. And then Calvin moved on for a time to study at Bourges. And there he studied under a jurist by the name of André Alchiat, who was Italian. And he introduced Calvin to the world of humanist scholarship. That means he didn't just read legal texts as legal documents, which is how, as legal authorities, which is how people had been doing it, but he analyzed them from a literary point of view, seeing them in their historical context. And that's a method which Calvin learned and brought with him to all of his theological writings. Well, in 1531, Calvin's father died, and that released him from the obligation to study law. You may remember Luther got out of that obligation by virtue of going through a thunderstorm, but for Calvin, it was his father dying. And so Calvin returned to Paris to pursue his literary studies. And the following year, he published his first work, a commentary on the Roman philosopher Seneca, a commentary on the theme of clemency. Now, Erasmus, who I mentioned before, Erasmus himself had written a commentary on this work. And Calvin, very precocious, seems to be suggesting that he can do better than Erasmus. Okay, Erasmus wrote a commentary, but hey, I've written one. This is the one you should use. The scholarly public were not altogether convinced, and the book didn't sell well. Now, around this time, Calvin was converted to the Protestant cause. And this is his account of the event. Since I was too obstinately devoted to the superstitions of popery to be easily extricated from so profound an abyss, God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. And so Calvin then immediately devoted himself to theological study. So not now literary studies, making himself a famous writer, but theological studies. Now, on the 1st of October, 1533, the new rector of Paris University, a man called Nicholas Cop, gave a mildly Protestant speech here in this church, the Église des Mathurins. This speech provoked the wrath of the authorities, both on Cop and anyone else associated with it. That includes Calvin, because here we have a copy of the speech in his own handwriting, in Calvin's handwriting, so he clearly had something to do with it. Some have suggested he even authored it. And he had to leave town in a hurry, a real hurry. So he spent some time down in the south west of France at Angoulême. What's happening here? Yeah, with Angoulême. And stayed with a friend by the name of Louis du Tillet, who was a priest in this particular church near Angoulême. They shared a common interest, concern for the reform of the church, but eventually their ways parted because du Tillet became a loyal Roman Catholic, and Calvin, of course, went in a different direction. Well, the following October, there were a number of placards, sort of posters, attacking the Roman Catholic Mass, posted all around Paris. And it's even said that one of them was put on the door of the king's bedchamber. Well, the king, Francis I, was certainly not amused. He was furious and launched a vigorous onslaught on the evangelicals. So Calvin deemed it best to leave France and settle in Basel with the aim of studying and writing. And there's Basel as it was in the 16th century, and there it is as it was recently. And while we're at it, I'll just show you a couple of portraits of the young Calvin. There's one there looking quite sort of dashing, and another one here. Okay, so Calvin settled in Basel. He devoted his time to writing, and by the summer of 1535, he had finished the first edition of his Institutes. We'll be thinking more about that, the Institutes, tomorrow. But his peaceful life of scholarship wasn't to last for long. In 1536, he was on his way to Strasbourg, at that point a German city, and then a local war forced him into a detour, and he went through Geneva. And it's been called the most fateful traffic diversion in European history. There's another picture of Geneva, and there's a model of what the city was like at that time. Now, Geneva had just accepted the Reformation, partly for political reasons. And Calvin intended just to spend one night there. But he didn't reckon with Farel, who was the leader of the Genevan reformers. And Farel called round and told Calvin he had to stay. Here's Calvin's account. After having learned that my heart was set on devoting myself to private studies, for which I wished to keep myself free from other pursuits, and finding that he gained nothing by entreaties, Farel proceeded to utter an imprecation that God would curse my retirement and the tranquillities of the studies which I sought, if I should withdraw and refuse to give assistance when the need was so urgent. By this imprecation, I was so stricken with terror that I desisted from the journey which I had undertaken. So Calvin settled in Geneva, and the city council made a note, line 3, the first two words, that illegalis, that Frenchman, was being employed. Well, they soon discovered just who that Frenchman was. Calvin ministered in Geneva from 1536 to 1538. But at that stage, he was still impetuous and immature. He and Farel attempted, without success, to get all the Genevans individually to sign a Protestant confession of faith. He also wrote a catechism, picture there, for use in the church. Well, matters came to a head when the city authorities ordered the ministers to adopt certain ceremonies from their Protestant neighbor, the canton of Bern. Calvin and Farel felt this was an undermining of the freedom of the church and refused to give way. The result was they were both exiled. And Calvin's comment was this: well and good. If we had served men, we would have been ill requited. But we serve a good master who will reward us. Calvin withdrew to Basel. Okay, time to continue with his peaceful studies. But that was not to be. Martin Bucer, the reformer Martin Bucer, urged Calvin to join him in his work at Strasbourg. And there's a picture of, an old picture of Strasbourg, but as you can see, painted on a wall, and another picture here from the time. Calvin resisted until Bucer took a leaf out of Farel's book and threatened Calvin with the example of Jonah, that Calvin was, fleeing away from the call of God. Calvin reluctantly gave way. And while he was in Strasbourg, he ministered to the small congregation of French refugees meeting in this church, St. Nicholas Church. Apart from his poverty, his days at Strasbourg were not unpleasant. He enjoyed the contact with Martin Bucer and a number of other leading reformers who were also in the city. Calvin learned a lot from Bucer, and Bucer has been called the first Calvinist. More on this later when we think about Calvinism and how it relates to Calvin. Bucer ministered here in the Thomaskirche, and there's an interior view, I should say, and lived right by the church here in the deanery. Calvin would have spent much time there, and also in another house nearby which belonged to a friend. Well, in 1539, the Roman Catholic Cardinal Sadolet wrote a letter to the Genevans urging them to return to the Roman fold. They simply forwarded the letter to Calvin and said, you deal with it. And Calvin, within a few days, wrote his reply to Sadolet, which is reckoned to be one of his best works. Now, in Strasbourg, the Anabaptists, the people, I haven't got time to go into them, ones who refused, didn't believe in the state church or infant baptism, they were treated more gently than in other places. They weren't put to death, in other words. And there were debates with them, especially in this church here, the Santa Madeleine Church. And that's probably the one time that Calvin would have actually met a live Anabaptist. And another formative event for Calvin at this time was his marriage in 1540 to Idelette de Boer, who was the widow of a former Anabaptist. They had one child who died in infancy. And Idelette herself died in 1549 at the age of just 40. Now, while at Strasbourg, Calvin was able to take part in some of the colloquies taking place between Protestants and Roman Catholics in the years 1539 to 41. And through this, he became acquainted with Philip Melanchthon, Luther's sidekick. Calvin was also at the famous Regensburg colloquy, which took place in 1541, which came closer than any other to producing agreement. And here's in the building, on the wall of the building where it actually took place, and more recently, somebody has erected this picture of Melanchthon on the right and Eck, the leading Roman Catholic theologian, on the left. Well, this colloquy failed just as all the colloquies failed for one simple reason. The Protestants insisted that all teaching be tested by Scripture, while the Roman Catholics insisted that it be tested by the official teaching of the Church. Now, while Calvin was at Strasbourg, the church in Geneva was going from bad to worse. Eventually, in 1540, the magistrates in desperation asked him to return. And here's the letter. He was appalled, having earlier stated of the prospect of a return to Geneva, "I would prefer 100 other deaths to that cross on which I should have to die 1,000 times a day." Experience was to prove that this estimation was not unreasonable. That's how it turned out. However, he said, "a solemn and conscientious regard to my duty prevailed with me to consent to return to the flock from which I had been torn. But with what grief, tears, great anxiety and distress I did this, the Lord is my witness." So Calvin returned to Geneva in 1541 and lived in this house, or at least to be more precise, he lived in the house that was on that spot. It was a very different house in those days, and there's a little plaque there which tells you about that. And this particular document from the City Council, which is, can't read so clearly, apart from the handwriting that is, notes his return. His fears were amply justified. There was a long and bitter struggle in which Calvin fought for the spiritual independence of the Genevan church and for the imposition of a rigorous discipline. The rules he sought to impose, regulating dress, prohibiting dancing and things, were mostly traditional medieval laws. The novelty was that Calvin sought actually to enforce these laws and enforce them also on the whole of Genevan society, not exempting the ruling classes. For many years, Calvin had to face intense opposition from the magistrates. But eventually, his opponents were discredited and there was a pro-Calvin city council. In the final years of his life, he was highly respected, though his wishes were not always obeyed. Now, this is the Tour Baudet, part of the city hall, and to give you a flavor of what the ruling classes were like, here is a ramp you see in this picture, the ramp going up circularly, and there's a picture of it, and you can see perhaps that it's sort of not very smooth, and the reason is it was to enable the councillors to ride their horses right up to the top, so they could ride to the top and then just get off and go into the building. Then no climbing the stairs for them. Now, in the 16th century, all across Europe, the state was tightening its grip on the church. In Roman Catholic countries like France, no bishop could be appointed without the approval of the king. In Protestant countries, the reformers needed the cooperation of the state to introduce reformation. And usually the price for this was greater state control of the church. Calvin sought to resist this trend. He's been accused sometimes of being the dictator of Geneva, but that is totally wide of the mark. Even at the height of his power was moral rather than legal. At no point was he ever allowed to publish a book without the approval of the city authorities. And the city council intervened on issues like the length of sermons. What Calvin sought was the freedom of the church, but not separation of church and state in the modern sense like in America. If you think of the relation between church and state at that time, think of the relation today between, for instance, the Foreign Office and the Treasury in a modern state. They're both departments of the state. They aren't separated from each other, but they're both part of the same government. They are, if you like, interdependent. And the issue is the relative authority each one has and how they relate to each other. Well, Calvin taught and ministered at Geneva, and we'll look closer at that tomorrow. But there were three parish churches in Geneva. There's the Saint-Madeleine, which you see here from above and here from below, Saint-Germain, and also Saint-Gervais. And he would have preached at different times in all three. But the main church was the cathedral, that's what it used to look like, and that's what it looks like now with the new front on it. And Calvin preached mainly, but not exclusively, there. Now, this claims to be Calvin's chair. I mean, I dare say that during his 20 to 30 years in Geneva, he did sit down on a number of chairs, and perhaps this is one of the ones he sat on. He also gave lectures, as opposed to preach, in this chapel next to the cathedral, known as the Auditoire. And here is the niche where he taught. And just note the surround of the niche, because you'll see that same surround in this picture. Students, I don't know if anybody's doing it now, students doodling during lectures. That's what, while he was lecturing, that's what one of the students was doing, showing him in action. Well, probably the most famous event in Calvin's ministry concerns Michael Servetus, a Spaniard who denied the doctrine of the Trinity. He had already been condemned to death in France, but had managed to escape. In 1553, he came to Geneva without any attempt at concealment. Calvin was very unpopular at the time, and Servetus might have imagined that he would be able to supplant him, which was a grave miscalculation. He was immediately arrested and put on trial for heresy. He was condemned to die, a verdict that was greeted with all but unanimous approval, enthusiastic approval at the time. There were only a handful of people who felt that was wrong. Calvin urged a more merciful form of death, but the city council insisted that he be burned at the stake. And that took place, you can actually see it in the top left-hand corner of that picture here. And it took place at this place where, as you can see, there's a monument to him, a relatively recent one around the year 1908 or something like that, and marking the spot where he was killed. And as with Calvin in Noyon, the street nearby is called the Rue Michel Servet, and they choose to pass over the heresy and just describe him correctly as a Spanish doctor. Right, okay, where are we? Yes. I'll go back to that one. So there is a myth that Calvin deliberately lured Servetus to Geneva to kill him. That is completely untrue. Calvin warned him not to come. Also, some years earlier, Calvin risked his own life to meet Servetus in Paris. They had a date to meet on a street corner, and Calvin risked his own life to turn up, but Servetus never showed up. Now, today, the death of Servetus is regarded as the greatest blot on Calvin's record. Ironically, at the time, that was what made his reputation. And Calvin's opponents in Geneva made the big mistake of opposing the condemnation of Servetus, and that utterly discredited them. And from that time on, the city council was controlled by, for the rest of his life, by Calvin supporters. And Calvin was even made a citizen of Geneva. So I notice where I make that point. Far from being the dictator, only at the end of his life did he even become a citizen. So, you know, he didn't get it, it wasn't all in one direction. Now, a much more positive achievement of Calvin was the founding of the Genevan Academy in 1559. And that is the precursor of the modern University of Geneva, and drew on the educational pattern that Calvin had seen in Strasbourg. The original buildings survive and are now a school. The academy was founded with the aim of training pastors to go back into France. And Calvin's great desire was for the Reformation to prevail there. Of course, he was French. All along, his real aim was to bring the Reformation to France. And many of those who lived and studied in Geneva were not Genevans, but religious refugees from countries like France, e.g. Calvin, and from countries like England. Well, Calvin certainly transformed Geneva, and the Scots reformer John Knox declared it to be, quotes, the most perfect school of Christ that ever was in the earth since the days of the apostles. In other places, he says, I confess Christ to be truly preached, but manners and religion to be so sincerely reformed, I have not seen in any other place. This was the result of Calvin's rigorous discipline. For those who disliked it, Calvin said, they should build a city where they can live as they want, since they don't want to live here under the yoke of Christ. Well, it was also the transformation of Geneva was a result of a massive influx into a tiny city of French and other refugees, drawn mostly by their admiration of Calvin. Basically, the city sold citizenship to people, and in the process suddenly realized they'd lost control of the city because the refugees more or less outnumbered them, and so Geneva became very different. Now, prior to 1536, Geneva was part of the Kingdom of Savoy, And it was early that year that the city achieved its independence, thanks especially to this man here, Philibert Berthelier, who commemorated in that. And it's on the back of that that the Reformation was introduced. The city remained independent for centuries and did not become part of Switzerland until 1815, at the instigation of Napoleon. Now, of course, the city is now French-speaking, and Calvin preached in French, but it was a foreign language to many of the inhabitants at that time. French was a foreign language. Now, Calvin claimed with justice that, quotes, "I have a natural love of brevity." Yet he was one of the most prolific writers in the history of the church. His output would have been remarkable for a full-time scholar. Yet Calvin fitted it into a schedule that would have exhausted two lesser men. Apart from all his responsibilities at Geneva, he was the most important leader of the international network of Reformed churches. His letters filled many volumes, and a list of their recipients will be like a who's who of Reformation Europe. Well, Calvin wrote many polemical treatises, and several of these were directed against Anabaptism. More important were his attacks on Roman Catholicism. I've already mentioned the reply to Sadolet, and he also published the Acts of the early sessions of the Roman Catholic Council of Trent with his own antidote added to it. Calvin was capable of as biting a satire as any of Erasmus, as can be seen from his, to give you the full title, Admonition, in which it is shown how advantageous for Christendom would be an inventory of the bodies and relics of saints, known as the Treatise of Relics. And I've got a long quote here, but I think as time's going by, I won't read it. But he basically says, you know, there are four heads of John the Baptist around Europe. What sort of monster must he have been? There's enough milk from Mary to float a ship and so on, and the whole lot of it would have been very, probably very offensive to, he probably done for hate speech today, but it just ridicules the whole idea of relics. And he says about, I'll just read you one bit, about the cross, the relics of the cross. There is no abbey so poor as not to have a specimen. In some places, larger fragments exist, as in Paris and the Holy Chapel, at Poitiers and at Rome, where a crucifix of tolerable size is said to be made entirely out of it. In short, if all the pieces which could be found were collected into a heap, they would form a good shipload, though the gospel testifies that a single individual was able to carry it, and so on. It's a mocking account. Now, I say this more quietly because I'm in Finland. Calvin was also forced, against his will, to write against the Lutherans. The big issue dividing Protestants at that time was the Lord's Supper. Is Christ's body present in the Lord's Supper, as Luther maintained? Luther taught that the body and blood of Christ are present in, with, and under the bread and wine. So everyone who receives the bread and the wine, believer or unbeliever, receives Christ's body. Zwingli in Zurich regarded the bread and the wine as symbolic only. Of course, Christ is present by his Holy Spirit, as always, but Christ's body and blood are located in heaven and cannot also be on earth. Martin Bucer, who was at Strasbourg, he put forward a middle way. He accepted with Zwingli that Christ's body is on heaven, not on earth, but also maintained that we enjoy a real spiritual communion with it. Calvin followed Bucer on this. Now, Zwingli died in 1531, and he was replaced by Heinrich Bullinger. And Calvin reached a common statement on the subject with Bullinger, the 1549 Zurich Agreement. This required Calvin to tone down some of his teaching. Just how much is still a matter of controversy. Well, this Zurich Agreement greatly displeased the more zealous supporters of Luther, and two Lutheran pastors attacked Calvin's doctrine of the Lord's Supper, and he responded to them. Eventually, he abandoned the controversy, which grieved him because Calvin saw himself as a disciple of Luther. Now, not all of Calvin's treatises were polemical, and one of his finest ones is the short treatise on the Lord's Supper. in which he sets out his teaching in a conciliatory way as a middle way between Zwingli and Luther. It is said that Luther was sympathetic to it, but that is relying on hearsay. Certainly Melanchthon, Luther's younger colleague, moved to a position much closer to Calvin's. Well, Calvin died on the 27th of May, 1564. He had a period of some weeks of decline, and so he knew he was dying, and he was able to bid farewell to the city authorities, to the ministers and others, and to individuals, so he had time to make his farewells. And he asked to be buried in an unmarked grave, fearing the rise of a cult of Calvin. One grave in the cemetery now is marked with the initials J.C., but all that we can say about it is that Calvin was buried somewhere around there. Now, Calvin may not have had a marked grave, but he certainly left his mark on the city. And we see that most clearly in the 19th century Reformation wall, which commemorates Calvin and other Reformation heroes. But this can give a wrong impression, however, as the one who is most in line with today's Geneva is not Calvin, but the skeptical deist philosopher Voltaire. Voltaire divided his time between Geneva and Ferney, across the border in France, basically living in whichever was the safer location at the time. Now, in 2009, I was involved with the conference at Geneva in the days leading up to the 27th of May, the anniversary of his death. Calvin's theology was expounded during the day, anniversary of his birth. Actually, it isn't the 27th of May, it's whatever it was in August when he was born. Got the mistake. Anyway, Calvin's theology was expounded during the day, and in the evening, a series of great evangelical preachers preached from Calvin's pulpit in the cathedral. That conference ended on the 26th. Well, whatever it was, the day before the day that Calvin was born. And the next day, the actual anniversary of his birth, there was a service in the cathedral, which I attended with my wife. And halfway through the service, she turned to me and she said, "Does Jesus have anything to do with this?" The service was supposedly commemorating Calvin, but the reality was more Voltaire than Calvin. Now, there were also some more light-hearted commemorations. Note the pun on Calvin, the French for wine. And Calvin also was present in other ways on that occasion. Now, Calvin has not had a good press. He himself wrote in 1559, "Never was a man more assailed, stung, and torn by calumny than I was." And these words were to be more prophetic than he could have realized. This picture here claims to portray Calvin being branded on the back for homosexuality, but it's pure fiction. There was nothing like that ever happened. He is blamed for the doctrine of predestination, so clearly taught by Augustine, by most medieval theologians, and by all the reformers. But more on that later on. Of course, he's vilified for his part in the execution of Servetus, although his contemporaries applauded him almost to a man. And other people who today are regarded as saintly, like Thomas More in England, persecuted heretics far more fiercely than Calvin did. We've got to judge him against the background of his times. Now, of course, Calvin was not perfect, and I think we'd say he had two main faults. The first one he was aware of and apologized for. He suffered from a bad temper. He was quick to fly off the handle. The second one is he was also intolerant, assuming too readily that people who opposed his teaching were opposing God's teaching. But that was a fault he shared with many others then and some others now. But to some extent, Calvin's ill repute is the fault of his disciples, who often upset the careful balance of his theology. But more on that a little later. Now, I'll conclude with a few portraits of Calvin. This is first by the Italian painter Giuseppe Archimboldo, who liked to make portraits of people by using, putting fish together. That was from 1566. And then there's some others here of Calvin from his own time. and ending with that one. Right. Thank you.